My name is Father Daryl Winkler. I'm the pastor of St. Basil's Parish in Ottawa. Happy that you have joined us on this afternoon's Conversations for Our Times Zoom series with Mother Maggie Helwig. So I'm going to begin with a statement of welcome and a land acknowledgement. We at St. Basil's Parish regard the love of God to be the foundation of all life and ministry. We believe in the ever-present love of God as witnessed through Christ and empowered by the Holy Spirit. We believe that each person is loved by God and is of sacred worth. Therefore, through God's grace, we welcome all persons to our community, faith community. We express God's hospitality by creating a safe, healing, and accessible and transforming place for all to enter. Further, we acknowledge with gratitude and with respect that we gather here in Ottawa on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. We honor their long history of welcoming many nations to this beautiful territory, and we uphold and uplift the voice and values of our host nation. Now I'm going to turn it over to Kevin Burns.
Yes, so this is Conversations for Our Time, and what we encourage is participation through conversation, and we'll start that using the chat line. If you have a question, pop it in as soon as the question comes up, and then as we progress, we'll probably open up the lines and it'll be a bit more back and forth directly. So please feel free to ask your question as we go using the chat line, and I'll be keeping a track of those questions, and then we will move into a conversational back and forth process, if you like, approach after the presentation. And to introduce our guest today, I'm going to ask our colleague Marianne McLean, who has been deeply involved with issues of social justice in our parish here at St. Basil's in Ottawa. And it is her task now to introduce our guest. Marianne, please.
Thank you, Kevin. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Good. When you meet Mother Maggie, you soon realize that she has many talents. Maggie is a writer of poetry, essays, fiction, and sermons, as well as an active member of the cultural community. Maggie is also a committed social justice and human rights activist. Maggie is also an Anglican priest ordained 10 years ago. She was named to St. Stephen's in the Fields, which is located on College near Spadina in Toronto, in 2013, and named rector of that parish in 2015. Maggie has given space for the homelessness to shelter in tents on St. Stephen's church grounds. Speaking personally as a Roman Catholic who came of age in the 1960s, I see Mother Maggie as responding to the same call that the Second Vatican Council identified for our church, that we must go out to the world. I have been moved by her gentleness, both as a family and a religious mother, and by her strength and passion in supporting social justice in our communities. So let us remember Mother Maggie's words on unmet human needs and justice. Quote, "Ephatha, says the voice of God, be opened, raise voices, open doors, let the bread be given freely, the bread which none of us deserve and all are offered. For there is enough, there is always enough. It is only our own false distinctions which would tell us otherwise. Let the silent voices speak, and speak for long enough that in their truth will slowly emerge. We cannot heal everything. Most days we can't heal much at all, but we can open the house, and that at least is a place to start." Thank you.
So Maggie Helwig, if you could unmute and you could begin now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Marianne, for that lovely introduction. I will have difficulty living up to that. I believe I was also asked to provide some poetry of my own, which I failed to do.
Thank you very much. And thank everybody for your patience on this.
I just got back from a memorial service where they were determined that they were going to play music from a laptop in a shelter at the shore of the lake. So really, this is small potatoes in tech problems compared to that. Anyway, age of crisis. We've got so many intersecting crises going on right now. I think it's hard for people to hold them all in their minds, and I think in a way it's hard to grasp how significantly this is an age of intersecting crises. But I found myself in the parish living at the intersection of a lot of them in a way I didn't really anticipate. I've said to people, I'm living in a dystopia all the time now. I feel sometimes rather distant from a lot of my colleagues. The climate crisis is something which I think we're all aware of. We all know that this is potentially a threat to all of human life on this planet, to the integrity of creation in a profound way. It is so large, it is really very hard to think about. But some of the manifestations of the climate crisis are natural disasters on a scale we haven't seen before. Fires, floods, mass displacement of people. There's also significant economic impacts now beginning to develop from climate change, which is one factor in the much larger economic crisis. Let me put it in the terms that I see it in. The engine of capitalism is now operating in such a way that it is only able to generate wealth for the wealthy. That's its primary purpose, and that's what it's continuing to do, but it is crushing more and more people in pursuit of that aim. The economy is more and more based on a kind of imaginary debts, futures, speculation, mathematical engine, which has very little relationship to real goods for real people, and in fact is leaving most real people deprived of the real goods of existence: food, shelter, relationship, the ability to create. And more people are in quite a desperate situation. It has not hit Canada yet as badly as it has hit some other countries which have been thought of as developed countries and which are beginning to spiral downwards. The UK and the United States were both seeing a spiral downwards, which is much faster than what we're seeing in Canada. But we're certainly seeing in Canada a radically increased rate of things like homelessness, food bank use. We all know the medical system is crumbling at this point. Some of this, of course, is because of the several decades of insistence that the common good doesn't exist, that taxation is bad, that anything directed at the common good rather than the individual good is some kind of terrible thing. Intersecting with the economic crisis significantly is the opiate crisis, which is a complex and multifaceted issue, but includes predatory practices by drug manufacturing companies, which includes limited access to medical care, causing people to rely increasingly on powerful pain-killing drugs, lack of access to mental health care, lack of access to rehabilitation, lack of access to employment, lack of access to anything that could create self-esteem in a human being. And on top of this, an increasingly poisoned drug supply. So the opiate deaths are mounting up, leaving in their wake trauma, which is deepening the mental health and psychological health issues people are already dealing with. They are now also dealing with deep grief, multiple losses, death upon death upon death, rolling out at an incredible pace. There is the housing affordability crisis, the construction of quite a bit of new apparent housing stock, very little of which is affordable, much of which is not actually being lived in by anyone but held as investment properties. And more people who are unable to access even inadequate shelter, even the nasty rooming houses increasingly do not exist because they have been knocked down for condos, because they have been redeveloped, because they are economically out of reach for many people. The shelters in Toronto filled up a long time ago. There has not realistically been a shelter bed in Toronto for years. And into all these intersecting crises, of course, came a pandemic. There was one moment there where it actually seemed like the pandemic could be a kind of kickstart to take us in a better direction, where we actually saw hotels being leased by the city for shelter for people without housing, where we saw people actually expressing care for the common good and talking about looking after each other and looking out for each other. That lasted under a year. We're not building back better, we're building back much worse. The dynamics of the insistence that we must emerge from the pandemic, that we must be now post-COVID, is manifesting in yet another kind of attack on community, attack on the social good, insistence that everything must be treated as an individual and personal choice, and that every individual person is going to do what they think is best for them, and that it is somehow horrendous authoritarianism to suggest otherwise, to suggest that a concern for the common good and making choices for the common good might actually be the direction in which we should be going. Instead, we're being encouraged to think of ourselves as all little isolated individuals who should only pursue our own good and our own interests and not think about anyone else's. If you don't want to wear a mask, nobody should ever make you wear a mask, even if that means that children are dying in the hospital. That they're dying outside of the hospital because there is no room in the hospital. So it's become another driver of this ferocious individualism. So in the middle of all this is my little parish church. We are a very small church, physically very small. Our building is quite tiny. For a church, we're a tiny property. We have a fairly small congregation, although I will say it's a congregation that tends younger than many, so that's encouraging, but it is a fairly small congregation. We don't have very much money, but we have for some time been a church which is known for engagement with the community and for a kind of welcome and inclusiveness, which I think is unusual. And I'm proud of my congregation for the way that they are able to be open to, welcoming of, inclusive of really everybody. one of my congregants says to me sometimes, you know, lots of churches say everybody's welcome. The reason I'm at this church is I think this church actually means it. And we've always been seen, or been seen for a long time, as a safe space for people who are marginalized. There have always been a few people sleeping on the grounds of the church. We have a tiny, tiny grounds, I mean, minuscule, but there have always been a few people sleeping on the step, sleeping on the bench. That's been part of parish life long before I was there. There are letters in the files. Doctors Hospital, a hospital in Toronto that eventually closed, had administrative offices in the church at one point in the 90s. And there are letters on file from Doctors Hospital writing to the rector, complaining about the number of homeless people hanging around outside the church. And the rector writing back to say, what kind of hospital are you anyway? So, like I say, this predates me. But as you're probably aware, at the beginning of the pandemic, people who were worried about going into overcrowded shelters and who had been deprived of all the other kinds of gathering places, the lobbies of malls, the 24-hour coffee shops, the Tim's, the McDonald's, the lobby of Toronto Western Hospital, with the pandemic restrictions, all of those were gone. The entire informal support structure was gone. The out of the cold programs all shut down. Every kind of informal support around which people had built their lives was gone overnight, instantly. It was a huge trauma. We never closed our drop-in. At one point, we were one of 5 drop-ins that continued to be open in the entire city of Toronto. The first night after the COVID restrictions came down, someone actually ripped our back door off. He was so desperate to get in. People were coming in crying. They were saying, this is the first time I've been able to sit down in 3 days. They were saying, you know, I've been sleeping on public transit because there is nowhere else. The level of trauma of that week was huge. But as a response to all this, people began setting up tents in parks in Toronto and elsewhere, and developed supportive communities. There were definitely issues. There were problems in many of these encampments, but there were also supportive communities there. There were people who could respond when someone overdosed. There were people who could provide some degree of social and psychological support for each other. So quite a few of the parks gathered encampments, and because there are thousands of homeless people who cannot access shelter beds in Toronto because there are no shelter beds, so they're just full. They're just full. People don't understand that they are full. The encampments got larger and larger, and as people decided that they had to get back to normal life when the pandemic was over, the city of Toronto began evicting encampments, often with significant violence. I was not present at the most violent of the evictions, which was Lamport Stadium, but I was present at Trinity Bellwoods. At one point, I was standing in the park and there was a line 6 deep of riot squad police with shields, with clubs, with guns, with the whole face gear, just walking towards us, beating on their shields as they do and yelling as they do, because that's part of the crowd dispersal process. And it was me and a few other advocates and a tiny number of homeless people sitting in their tents. And there were helicopters overhead. There were busloads of police surrounding us. It was an extraordinary paramilitary operation in the middle of Toronto. Because some homeless people were living in tents in a park. So the encampments were cleared, and the big encampments were cleared first, and then the smaller encampments were gradually cleared, one after another, one after another, one after another. And people started setting up tents in the yard of the church. And you need to understand, as I've been stressing how small we are, our front yard is no larger than the front yard of a medium-sized home. It's not a big yard, but we have 12, 15 tents. We have maybe 30 people. People are also camping in the where we had a community garden. We've had to give up our community garden because people have started setting up tents there because they have nowhere else to go. And I hate losing my community garden, but people have nowhere to go. Last winter, we tried to call central intake the way you're supposed to do to look for a shelter bed for people who needed shelter. And the best response we ever got, most of the time they didn't even answer the phone, the best response we ever got was, well, if you go down to the Streets to Homes office at 129 Peter Street and wait outside for long enough, maybe someone will leave and then you can go and sit in a chair in the lobby. That was the best offer of overnight shelter we had all winter, last winter, for any of the people visiting our drop-in. People are being discharged from emergency rooms directly onto the street. One young man that I know was back on the street within 24 hours of coming out of ICU. Because the hospitals are also overloaded. They have to move people out of the hospitals, but they can't move people into shelters or into any form of housing because there is nothing. So we have tents surrounding our little church now. And it's very difficult. It's very difficult because it's heartbreaking. It's very difficult because people shouldn't be living there, because it's terrible to be advocating for the right of people to live in tents in a churchyard when nobody should be living in a tent in a churchyard. It's not how a human being should live, because I see that people are overcrowded and their mental health is deteriorating and they're cold and they're sick and they shouldn't be there, but there is nowhere else they can be. We have had many overdoses. No one has died because other encampment residents have responded very quickly. They all have naloxone. They all know how to use naloxone. They know how to do CPR. They recognize the signs of an overdose and they're there long before any emergency service could get there. We've had people taken to hospital and then, you know, they're back very soon because hospitals can't hold anybody. Occasionally people get arrested for random reasons and also come back very quickly in general. We've had definitely issues with neighbors. Some neighbors have been extremely supportive. Others have been extremely hostile. Many letters have been sent to my bishop. And I will say my bishop has been absolutely supportive. I appreciate very much the level of support that I've had from my bishop and from the Anglican Diocese of Toronto. They've been unquestioning, unhesitating in their support. Someone apparently phoned up the head of property and complained about the encampment, and the head of property at the diocese laughed at them. That was maybe not the best response, but somewhat gratifying. I actually do have a member of my congregation now who is our community relations person. So any complaints that come in, he tries to engage in dialogue. Turns out most of the people who are angry don't actually want to engage in dialogue. They just want to yell. And if somebody comes back to them and says, well, let's talk about your concerns, they fall amazingly silent. But it is a horrible situation. People need housing. People need lives. And they're living in these tents in my yard, and there's no solution on the horizon for this. The night before last, Friday night, there was a man in the church who was disoriented, exhausted, ill. He couldn't even get his shoes on properly. He had nowhere to go for the night. And the only thing I could do for him was to walk him out to the tents and wake up some of the people in the tents and say, could you please look after this man for tonight? And they did. And that there's a community in that. There's a kind of hope in that. But the extremity in which people are living is so painful, so heartbreaking. The role of the church in this is a complicated one. It is a difficult one. I mean, we must provide sanctuary. That is what we must do. There is no question. If people come to us and they need space and they need safety, we must provide it. But it's not a good way to live. It's not a sustainable way to live. I am also involved in the Social Justice and Advocacy Committee of the Anglican Diocese of Toronto. We do lobby the government constantly on issues relating to housing and poverty, but we are seeing things spiraling downwards rather than getting better. Increasingly, I see my role as just trying to hold on to a little island of people who still care about other people. Trying to hold my community together, trying to strengthen people to do whatever we are able to do in this crisis, to try to keep people's heads above water and to try just to keep people alive, to try to help people work through the burnout and the heartbreak and the sense of futility in that, and to continue to care about other people when every other force around them is telling them not to. The church has the ability to be a counterforce. The church has the ability to be the institution that still tells us to care about each other, that still tells us that we are all one body, that is real, and that is essential, and that is how we must live when no one else is saying that. We have the ability to be a space that is not bound by economics, a space which can be accessed by anyone without some kind of economic price of entry. And we are almost the only space left in society that is not bound to economics. It may be a strange, small rearguard action. We may be holding on to tiny patches of land in the middle of a flood that we cannot stop. But I can't see anything else that we can do. The church is bound by a different kind of economy, asked Christy. I'd be interested to know what you mean by that. I would rather escape the economic metaphor. But I don't know what you mean by that. So we might, we don't necessarily disagree, but I'm not comfortable with using economic language at this point. I think it's not taking us in a good direction. But it's a question for debate, for discussion. I'd be happy to move into discussion at this point. I like discussion Q&A format.
Okay, thank you. I'm very, very taken by this image of the little tents around a church. Many old imagery of an Anglican church especially would be the graveyard around the church, the tombstones, those in the community who remember lovingly and caringly and historically we walk past their stones into the building. Yet your building is of another order with these little tents. You said something very early on about your parish being a place of welcome. And you talked about how fragile and vulnerable that welcome is. Can you say more about what does it say about them as a community and what does it say about you as a leader of that community?
What it says about them as a community is that they are extraordinary people. there was one incident. One of my wardens actually ended up on the BBC, of all places, because Sukian Lee, who was freelancing for the BBC at that particular time, was in church. She is an occasional member of the congregation. She happened to be in church with a friend of hers, and a man came in off the street who was clearly having a crisis. And he came in. He was yelling. He was angry. He had some things to say about the church that were completely true. He came in. We kind of stopped the liturgy for a bit to give him a bit of space, and he went up to the altar, and I just sort of walked beside him to make sure that nothing really bad happened. And he walked up to the altar and spat on the altar. And Sukian said, I expected at this point, they're going to call the police, they're going to put him out, they're going to do something. And instead, my warden, who is a lovely elderly man from Trinidad, beautiful man, just came up and sort of put his arm around the guy's shoulder and, talked to him quietly and talked to him about what his problem was, and slowly, led him down into the seats and sat with him and continued to talk with him. And we were able to resume the liturgical action as well while Leroy sat with this man. And Sukian was just blown away by this. This was something she could never have imagined. And she interviewed Leroy about it, and Leroy was just like, well, it's about love, isn't it? It's just about love. It's the kind of love that Jesus showed to us, so we need to show to other people. And I think any community that has Leroy there in that sort of elder role that he takes is going to be a very healthy community. He's modeled some incredible love and acceptance for people. So yeah, I think it's my people are very good people, and there's been debate, there's been discussion. The Anglican Church, as you know, has been moving through our own processes around human sexuality and gender and how we understand them. And people in the congregation have moved on that at different rates, but there's been discussion, relationship, understanding, which I think has been consistent and productive, and has let us continue to be a welcoming space and to be able to expand the boundaries of welcome. What it says about me as a leader is that I have no standards, I guess. I'm just like, sure, come into my church. I don't care. Do you have clothes on? No? Okay, well, whatever.
I'm sure you have amazing standards. The second part of that question, though, was presumably when you were training to be an Anglican minister, what to do with the tent may not have been part of the curriculum.
Well, no, but, I was ordained quite late in life. I'd already had several other careers. So I'm one of the people who came into ordained ministry carrying a whole lot of previous life experience and a different perspective maybe than some people.
Okay, Carolyn has asked a question, and she's asked two. I'll ask the first one and she can ask you the second one herself. So the first one is, building on your church tent and bench housing, what are your reactions about a provincial church, a system of provincial church campgrounds that would be immediate and open to all faiths?
I think people need housing. I do worry about institutionalizing encampments, either on churches or on public grounds, or, the Out of the Cold program was initially meant to be an act of protest. The Out of the Cold program was initially meant to shock people and upset people so that people would say, oh my God, people are sleeping on church floors. We must change this. And instead it became institutionalized and became a safety valve for the shelter system. And I would not want to see encamping become the institutionalized response to homelessness. not a good way to live. It is not a good way to live. It may be right now the only way that people are able to live, but we can't accept that. We can't accept that people live in tents outdoors because we can't provide housing, and we can't even provide decent emergency shelter. So I would be very troubled by a move to institutionalize. We have to aim higher than that.
So Carolyn, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself. You had a second question. I'd like you to raise it yourself now.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. I hope I can articulate this. And I hear you, Mother Maggie, on the tents. I just think it would be a wonderful image, and it would help people, and it would shock people too. But truthfully, I was thinking of my own experience camping and the dignity and fun that it was. And if we could turn that to show that, to somehow, and give that maybe some dignity. Anyway, that would take a longer conversation. So the next thing I was thinking was, oops, did you hear anything?
Oh, I heard the next thing I was thinking, and then you went.
Oh, okay. Maybe that was God. The next thing I was thinking was low-income renters. And I don't know how to say this, I'll try my best, but I live in a place where my rent was reduced and hundreds of dollars over COVID with no requirement to pay it back. I know, and I'm not telling who. I know, see your eyes, but in a private conversation maybe, or I think people need to talk to their municipal, private, co-op landlords and church-led housing. I just want to put it out there. There are good landlords, and there are good ways to do that. How we could model what happened to me is something I would like to talk about. It's basically your rent is reduced to an amount you can afford until you're able to pay it again. And it's done for a short-term period, but it sometimes goes longer. So my thought was, and bear with me, I hope someone can mirror this back. I was thinking of incentives that are given to developers. Maybe that's the wrong way to do it. Maybe I don't know how to say this, but what I'd like to see is the landlords having to go back to the government to get money the government has given to tenants to subsidize, like it's hard for me to explain that. I'm thinking rent banks. They don't work. People have to go to them when they are being evicted. And I've never known a client that it's ever worked for in the past. So what I'm trying to say is somehow could the government, through something like CERB, whether it's federal or provincial, like an OSAP kind of program to pay your rent, where you pay a minimum, like something really rethinking how we do rent, where it happens immediately. Like you get your rent is on hold for, like interest only, they do with student loans. You put your rent on hold and the government is paying the interest and the government is doing whatever and you don't pay your, yeah.
I think there are all kinds of ways that the government could structure programs around housing. There are many, many possibilities. What you're suggesting might be one, it might be part of it. There's lots of things the government could be doing. They're not doing it. They're not,
no, and they're not going to.
And what it requires is altering the way that we have been trained to think over the last several decades. It is currently regarded as normal, acceptable, and in fact mandatory to think of housing as a profit-generating thing. Landlords generate money from property. And this is regarded as good and natural and unavoidable. As long as we think about it that way, there will never be programs that are adequate to house people. There's lots of things the government could do, but they can only do it if they are willing to give up the idea that property exists in order to generate profit for landowners.
I think that's where you come in. I think your idea about the camping, that is just amazing. And Kevin's image of the graveyards, I mean, does that say a lot around the church, the campground and the graveyards? But maybe that's the training center. Invite people to your church to talk about changing how we look. Or maybe you do training sessions at all the campgrounds and all the churches around Canada on just starting small, talking to your own people.
I mean, I talk to my own, I think we need more people than me. I am one little Anglican priest. I think the church could be a really powerful resource if the church as body, if you know, the church as all kinds of clerics and lay people and everybody, if we were speaking with one coherent voice about a different imagination of what it means to be human, and if we were doing that loudly and powerfully and continually, maybe we could have an impact.
Oh, that would be wonderful.
Maybe we don't do that.
I want to move on to this issue of, you used the expression a different imagination just now, and that is a recurring element of these questions. It's about reimagining. The questions have a lot to do about reimagining the economy, and I want to wait a little bit before we get to that, because there's quite a few of those. And always in a Canadian conversation, when you start talking about statistics, it takes over. But we're talking about other issues here, and one is to do with imagination, how we imagine things, how we imagine space, how we imagine relationships. And this is the question. The word church, to most people, conjures up the image of a building. It's empty more often than it is full. How can we realistically change that image? What would it take? So this is the first in a series of questions about reimagining what it is we do, what we see, and how we interpret it, and how we image it.
Keeping the church open would be one thing. I mean, the pandemic got in the way of that. But St. Stephen's, it's an unusual church, has been before I got there. It had been through a difficult time. It had been through a time when it was closed a lot, but previous to that had established a sense in the community of the church as a place for the community and a community resource, which I was able to reactivate very easily because it was already there. If the church is a space which is open, which people walk into, where, you know, where there are programs like, part of the point of our Friday drop-in was always supposed to be that it's not just for people who are homeless. It has tended more in that direction. We've not been able to hold on to the more diverse interpretation we wanted, but there's still some sense of that, I think, that we try to hold, that we're not just open for homeless people to come and have dinner. We are open to be open. We try to have our doors open as much as we can. And as I said, the pandemic interrupted that. So there's some rebuilding that has to happen there. But I think within the little neighborhood of St. Stephen's, we are not really perceived as a building that's empty more than full. Our worship services are not huge, but we are open a lot for programming, or just for being open for people to wander in and out. The community sees the church as quite accessible. It's hard. It's hard work in a way. You have to be there, and you have to deal with people who come in who are sometimes demanding or irritating. But I think we need to get away from the idea that the church exists in order to get people to come in on Sunday morning and attend a worship service. That is one thing we are there for, absolutely. And I would never sacrifice it. The sacraments are central. The sacraments are absolutely central. But we are not a space that is only for the celebration of the sacraments, but for all the sacramental actions which flow from that. Being more open, even without having any other particular specific programs or resources, can at least start to make a difference in that, I think. I don't know.
Before we turn to what will be a segment on the economy, I'm sorry, but we're going to have to get to those questions. How about this one, which is to do with burnout? The question says, the situation that you describe is pretty terrible, and it's easy to imagine wonderful solutions. But how do you suggest that people react when they've become burned out by the amount of helping that's required? And they reach the point of asking, well, why can't these people just help themselves? So this issue of burnout and feeling unable and insufficient and limited in the face of such enormous demand.
I think that is probably where my role is perhaps most important in the community. And it's not about saying any of the traditional things that one says. It is, I think, about acknowledging that, in fact, we are living in a horrible situation, which is far beyond the ability of any of us to change it. That we need to be honest about that, that there are terrible, terrible gulfs of need out there, and we can't meet them all. We will be inadequate to the demand. We will always be inadequate to the demand. We can do those small things that we can do because that is what we are called to do. And that is what we must do. And we do it because we follow a God who died for love. Because we follow a God who came into human flesh and died for the love of us. And that in its time was also a futile gesture. We are human and we are limited. But we do what little we can because we must, and what we hold on to is the knowledge that we are loved and embraced, and that is all that we can ever count on. And there is nothing in this world that we can ever count on, but we can know that we are held. And that's all we have going forward. We don't know where the world is going. It seems to be going to places much worse even than we are now. But there is a great love out there that will not let us go, and we must act as we can within that love, knowing that we are human and we are limited, and we will fail, and we will fail over and over and over. And that's just who we are. And we need to be a community that loves and fails and tries again.
I'm sorry, we have to go from that spirituality to economics, but economics are knocking at the question door here. The next question, it sounds like an image from Germany, in the sense that in the German state, there is state funding for church denominations, and it's all centralized through a central government allocation. So the question is, what about building on the idea of church directing funds, rather that the church direct funds rather than political parties lead spending, decisions based on love rather than in dollars and cents? So funding, who should pay? Where should funding come from for churches in this country, especially those engaged in the work that you've been describing?
I'm not sure that's what the question is. You seem to have asked, you read out the question and then gave a paraphrase which seemed to be a different question than was being asked. So I'm a little confused about what I'm supposed to be answering here.
Well,
there's the idea of the church directing funding rather than political parties, which I think is one kind of quagmire. And then there's state funding for the church, which is a different kind of quagmire. They're both quagmires.
Yeah, okay, so let's stay in the mud and let's deal with who decides, political parties or churches, which is the first question.
The church has no credibility at this stage. We have destroyed our credibility over many generations. So I don't think that there is going to be much support for putting major decisions about directing huge public funding in the hands of the churches. Also, the church is not a universal body. If we could genuinely demonstrate that we are universal in our approach, it might be different. We haven't really done that. I think there's a tremendous distrust of the church, which we have earned. We have earned that distrust. Political parties, I mean, it is not meant to be political parties which lead spending, but governments, which is meant to be a different thing. In practice, they tend to be the same thing. But in theory, a governmental structure is meant to be all of us. There was a period which you can say that the church in, say, Europe in the Middle Ages, to a large extent, the church was all of us. That's only because they'd driven out the Jews. So, you know, even then, we didn't get there, honestly. You know, fair taxation and use of government structures to provide universal well-being seems to me still a model which has much to recommend it, even though current governmental structures and personalities and ideologies are failing extremely badly. And I would be worried about the church directing funds because there is this whole sort of, some people belong to the church and other people don't belong to the church, and how, you know, it's potentially very, very tricky. That said, there is lots of good programming which is led by churches. One of the best supportive housing projects that I have ever worked with is funded entirely, pretty much entirely by the Presbyterian Church. They get a small amount of government support, but it's primarily funded by the Presbyterian Church, in part because their approach doesn't fit neatly into a lot of the standard supportive housing categories. So, you know, it's not an either or, and it's not an absolutely exclusive thing. And anyway, I am not an economist or a political analyst, you know, but that's some random thoughts on that.
One more economics question, and the phrase living wage has come up a number of times. What are your thoughts about that? A government being responsible for a living wage?
That would be better than nothing. Setting minimum wage at a level where somebody who is employed full-time is not living in poverty would be a good first step. We're some considerable way from that. You can be employed full-time on minimum wage and you're still well under the low income cutoff. So that would be a step. But the emphasis on wage automatically disenfranchises those people who are, for all sorts of reasons, not able to work or not able to work full time. And the idea that we earn our humanity by doing a job is one we really need to identify and disentangle, because it's very deep in people's minds. Even if they don't think that way consciously, there's a real deep sense that you earn your humanity. I have a daughter with a quite significant disability. She's certainly never going to hold a paying job. People trying to be nice say things to me like, oh, but what she contributes is her lovely personality. Well, she does have a lovely personality, as it happens, but why does she have to contribute anything? Why does she have to pay to be a human being? Why do we fall back on this metaphor that, oh, well, the contribution, that's the veiled economics that you must pay in order to be human, whether you pay in by doing a job or in whatever way, that you earn humanity. I really fight against that. And so a living wage is a good thing. But the idea that every human being deserves to live a good and dignified life is really where we have to be pushing. The universal basic income has a lot of problems. There's a lot of issues with universal basic income, but at least it's moving more in that direction of everyone deserves to live a decent life, and you don't have to qualify for it by contributing something.
That's the why to a question. There's now a how to that same question. Elizabeth has said, how do we overcome our focus on ourselves and become more aware of the common good?
Read the Bible. I mean, I'm not joking. We have scriptures. We have generations of theological teaching. We have really, really good resources. We in the church have really good resources for a different concept of what it is to be human. It's there in the scripture, it's there in our theologians, it's there in the church councils, it's there in papal encyclicals, it's all there. We have this, we just need to grab hold of it. We are all one body. That is an absolutely basic Christian teaching. And everything else is really expanding on that.
What about those people who come to a church looking for that, looking for assistance with that, because they want to understand what it means to be caring for other people, what it means to believe in scripture and the consequences of that, but aren't quite ready yet to do the other stuff that, in a sense, their need may be more interior driven. Maybe that's what's compelling for them to come to one of your services.
What do you mean by the other stuff?
The social justice, the engagement, that in a sense, where to simplify where my question is going, is to move from an abstract expression of what it means to believe in things and a lived practice that is founded on the principles of that theology, that spirituality. So the shift from the thinking about it to the doing of it.
Again, I think it's about community, and it's about a modeling in community. I think, if people come and they want to learn about the theology and participate in the liturgy, and that's all they want to do, that's fine. That's perfectly okay. And hopefully deep participation in the liturgy and theological learning will enable them to go into the world and be differently, to exist in a different way. And that can be as powerful as the sort of the more obvious social justice activities. Just being in the world in a different way can be a real powerful thing. And if people are finding that they want to figure out how to be more actively engaged, they're going to have models in the community they can look to. They're going to say, oh, well, this is what this person does. This is what this person does. Maybe that would be something that it would be right for me to do, or maybe not. You know, absolutely, there are people who come to St. Stephen's who they come to the liturgy, they come to the Bible study, and they go into the world and live their lives, but they live their lives, I hope, as different people because of that.
Can I ask a question that isn't on the list here, and that is about you and as a writer? Is it different writing a homily, or how is it different from, given your work in poetry, your work in fiction? What happens into you in that process when you're preparing a homily? Is it a different kind of writing?
It's not radically different, no. I mean, the most significant thing that's different is when I'm writing a homily, I am explicating a text. I'm working with a text. I'm not originating the text. But a lot of writing is working with older texts and working with previous texts. Most writers are to some degree working with previous texts within a genre, within a field. I mean, my way into homiletics, my way into scripture was understanding it as a text, because I grew up in a very literary family, and I grew up understanding literary analysis and what you do with texts. And when I picked up a biblical commentary and read it and thought, oh, it's a text, and I know what to do with a text. I know how to analyze a text. That's what you do. It's part of literary work. That was my way into scripture initially. So it's not a radically different kind of writing. It has its constraints. It has, you know, you've got a time limit. You're speaking to an audience in a more direct way. So it's a little bit different, but it's not radically different. Marianne wants to offer a comment and question.
Yes, I can only speak from my own personal experience, but I found, in particular, working with refugees gave me a way to move beyond the constraints of an academic education and a government job, where logic and, you know, obedience to authority and everything else are demanded in the government or academic world, but where in dealing with a refugee family, and I'm thinking perhaps the one that was most significant and really first was a Rwandan refugee, listening to her story a number of times and seeing her bravery in adapting, and just realizing that friendship is something you can give to anyone, regardless of, you know, the huge difference in some ways in our backgrounds. I've, you know, literally never experienced anything like that. So I think that it's to move the heart and the mind together, and I think that's what the church and can give, and what community is so important for. We need community to listen to each other, to hear each other's stories, and then you know, I don't think we can leave people behind then, or it's much harder to do that.
Thank you. I'm now going to ask Michael Gleason to contribute his part of this conversation, and he may actually have some economic things to say because he's deeply involved in the finances of St. Basil's, but then again, he might not talk about that at all. So Michael Gleason, over to you, please.
This is the first time that I've had the honor of saying thanks, and I started with the idea of, it is said there's a time and a place for everything, a time to gather and to share, a time to be informed like we were today, a time to break down stereotypes, and a time to lift up those whose journey is difficult. There's a time to create hope for them and for us. There are things we can do, and a time to say thanks. Thank you, Mother Maggie. On behalf of those gathered today, thank you for sharing your knowledge and insight.
Thank you, Michael. And now Father Winkler will do the next piece for us. Over to you, Father Winkler.
Hello. I just want to thank Mother Maggie for being with us and sharing with us her. I'm repeating what Michael just said, but I really got a lot out of your experience and insight today. I really am appreciative that you were able to get some time to speak with us this afternoon. My mother was an Indigenous woman from Manitoulin Island, and her grandchildren, my nieces and nephews, have been trying to renew their own cultural awareness. And one of my nieces does beading. That's how she has, for her, it's become such, it's not just making things, there's a reality in beading that she takes very seriously. And I've asked her if she would make something for Mother Maggie today to show our appreciation. And so this is the, I think you can see it. I'm not sure. Can you see this? This is a pendant that she's made. It's a flower, like an Ojibwe flower. And that's what we want to do to show our appreciation for her today. Secondly, we will be sending a contribution to Mother Maggie's faith community, St. Stephen's in Toronto, to help. It's a small way to go, but it's a contribution from our faith community to yours, and helping you to make outreach to the people who are very experiencing such a difficult time. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored.
Okay, now this is the last in our series for this year, our last Conversations for Our Times. We're hoping that you'll stay tuned, and we will begin our next season in January. And so thank you all for signing on, participating, and learning from Mother Maggie this afternoon. God bless everybody. Thank you.